This supercharged Camaro ZL1 was listed at auction, as is, with structural damage and a worn clutch, which made it a super cheap Camaro ZL1. It was graded in rough condition with a score of 1.9 out of 5, but considering this score, the auction photos look pretty decent. Besides a few dings, the exterior is all there, but what really intrigued me was this picture of the engine bay. This overflow tank is definitely not from the factory, so it made me wonder what else has been modified on this car, and it turns out there's a lot, like that massive crank pulley and this auxiliary cooler in the front grille here. And just take a listen to the engine. It sure doesn't sound stock either. Truthfully, I knew this car was heavily modified before I even bid on it, because I did a quick Google search and found the original owner's post about it on a Camaro forum. It's cammed, pulleyed, the heads have been reworked, the blower's been ported with bigger injectors for more fuel, and it was claimed that the car makes 715 wheel horsepower, which is a lot more than it originally came with. Now, wheel horsepower can only be measured if the wheels are turning, which won't happen if the clutch is bad, but the strange thing here is that the auction listed it as running and driving, and the transporter drove it right off his truck and didn't mention any issues. I drove it home a few miles away, and while the pedal feels really stiff like there's an aftermarket clutch setup, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Now, when I got it home, I noticed that the front brake pads were pretty well gone, so I parked the car and ordered up a new set of pads, and just a few days later, I went to move the car. When I pushed in the clutch pedal, something was off. It just felt like air. Before it was very heavy, now there was basically no resistance. There we go. All right. Oh man, it doesn't want to go into gear at all. Come on. No way. Don't want to grind anything, but it won't go into gear, this car. I think we've lost hydraulic pressure, darn it. Oh look down here. This is not usual, look. See this? You'd think that this would be your clutch fluid. I didn't even notice this. Oh, look at how bad that fluid is. Try one more time, but I think we lost the clutch in this. You're not gonna believe it, but I'm feeling the clutch pressure come back right now. I'm feeling it. All we need is first gear, baby. All we need is first gear, and then we'll figure out your problems later. Come on. I feel a clutch. I feel a clutch. All right, here we go. Ah, there we go. Now, this is quite a coincidence because I just had a very similar issue on my manual Audi. When your clutch pedal has little or no resistance like this, it's not a problem with the clutch at all, but with the fluid that actuates the clutch. It's similar to your brakes. If there's no fluid, you won't have any brakes, so we have to find out where that fluid is going. Now, the problem with my Audi was a failed clutch master cylinder, which is the piston that moves the hydraulic fluid back towards the transmission to its slave cylinder when you push in the clutch pedal. So to figure out the source of our problem, I started with what I thought was the simplest place possible. Obviously, I just fixed my Audi's master cylinder, and the C6 Corvette is of a very similar generation to this Camaro, and they have master cylinders that are known to be very common wear items. So I just got underneath the clutch pedal here, felt all around the underside. You can kind of see the master cylinder if you look behind all these wires. And I felt the carpeting below it, and it's all dry. So we can guess that that master cylinder is probably fine and operating like it should. Since this doesn't seem to be the problem, then we can figure the slave cylinder inside the transmission would have failed, which means this car needs to go up on the lift, and we'll have to start a pretty big job. But in typical fashion, I'm completely overthinking everything here, and I've already kind of fixed our issue. If we go back and review that footage from earlier, you'll notice I go to grab the cap off the brake fluid container and then pause. That's because this car from the factory and a lot of other manual cars only have one reservoir that shares both the brake and the clutch fluid. When I noticed the additional reservoir buried in the engine bay, it's tilted on its side. Now, I had already tried pumping the clutch for a few minutes before I found all this, and I got nowhere. But shortly after placing the reservoir upright, When I started pumping again, the pedal came back enough to where I could put the car in gear. The fluid was upside down, so when I was hitting the pedal, I was sucking air in the lines and there was no hydraulic pressure. But with the bottle upright, even with the tiny amount of fluid left, it sucked it in when I pumped the pedal, building enough pressure to actuate our clutch. Now, I obviously got lucky, but when I was bidding on this Camaro, I factored in the cost of replacing this car's clutch into my final bid price, which was like a hair over 20,000 bucks. And if you had to get a clutch kit for a car with this amount of power, it would probably cost you between like $1,200 to $2,000. So I figured if I could get a 6-speed manual ZL1 well under 25 grand, that's with me doing all the work, it'd be a great deal. But the fact that we don't even have to touch the transmission, at least I don't think we do, makes it that much better. And every time I show you a car like this, I get a ton of questions with people asking me, what auctions do you shop at and how do you find the deals? And is there financing available? Now, this specific car came from an auction that does require a business license to participate, but there are public auctions all over the country where you don't need any credentials. And you got to just start simple. Go to Google and type in public auto auctions in your nearest major city, and you're bound to find some cool stuff. I even featured a video recently with a 2022 Corvette that was abandoned at a mechanic shop, and it was offered at this mechanic sale. This specific auction was announced in a public notice in a small local newspaper. So to find these deals, you really got to do some legwork. But I think the most important thing anybody who's just starting off in the auctions can do is to start small. You know, this Camaro was over 20 grand, which is a lot of cash, but my first auction cars cost like in the hundreds of dollars. As a matter of fact, let me show you one of the first cars I ever bought. And it all started right here with this pizza delivery car that we picked up for just $525. But it was a different time back then. You know, the auctions were much less attended, the fees were a lot lower, and again, you could just have fun with the few $100. But as I released videos on it and you guys seemed to enjoy it, I knew we had to up the ante, get something a bit more exciting, but that meant I needed a lot more cash. And well, going into the bank with a mediocre credit score and asking for tens of thousands of dollars to buy an Audi with a cracked frame and a salvage title didn't work out too well. Luckily, I found an alternate solution, and that's Revenued. Revenued is a business card and flex line that not only helped me get that infamous Audi, it helped me graduate my small business from just making videos to actually obtaining a dealer's license. And there's no credit checks because approvals are based on your business's performance. And with $500,000 in limits, it comes in very handy for me when it's time to buy some new inventory. And there's never any origination, maintenance, or draw fees. You'll only pay for the working capital that your business needs, and a little bit of extra capital can go a very long way when building your small business. So check out Revenued at the link down in the description box. It is super quick and easy to apply, and you can find out in as little as an hour whether your business is eligible for funding. All you got to do is hit that link in the description to learn a little more about Revenued. Since there's hardly any fluid in here, I just dumped out what was left into a rag and cleaned the inside of the reservoir. Now, back in the day when I had my first manual Corvette, there was a simple DIY posted in the forums to clean and exchange your clutch fluid. The idea is simple. The cleaner you keep the fluid, the longer all the components would last, and this method required no special tools at all, just a little bit of brake fluid. Basically, you would siphon out all the existing dirty fluid in the reservoir and fill it back up with fresh fluid. Then all you have to do is pump your clutch pedal a bit. You can see when we do this, whatever air and fluid left in the line is pushing its way up and mixing with the fresh fluid. I just repeated this a few times to freshen things up as best we can, and now we've got a clutch pedal that should be much more dependable. Now all we have to do is actually mount this somewhere so the fluid stays where it should, and I found online that everyone who adds one of these reservoirs just attaches it to the same mounting hole as the brake fluid container. Hopefully we're good to go here and we can just make sure everything works good when we get this car on the road. But first, let's get our brakes in order before we start testing out 700 horsepower. It's just the worst when someone lets their pads get down this low because it turns what would be a relatively easy and inexpensive brake job into something that's a lot more expensive. We got a little bit of lipping going on right here. It's not the worst I've ever seen. It's definitely not the best. But if they would have swapped this pad out a lot earlier, I'm betting that you could have much more confidently reused this rotor. I don't have the replacement rotor. I did get a set of replacement pads. For right now, I am going to hone this. We'll see how it works. But in the near term, we'd probably want to replace this. man, it just is annoying. I'm just looking at one other thing, and I don't see a brake pad wear sensor. And on all these newer cars, I bet you one generation of Camaro newer, this would have a sensor on it that once it got down, even well before it was this low, it would trigger that sensor, and then there'd be a light on the dashboard to tell the driver you need new brakes. So anyway, let's just get this all apart. We'll get a closer look at it, and let's hone this rotor. Let's come off now. Let's see. There we go. Okay, that's what we wanted. What's really cool about the ZL1 compared to any of the other supercharged V8 muscle cars is that it uses some really high-end hardware, like mag ride shocks, a real carbon fiber hood, and these two-piece rotors. This is something you normally see on an exotic car, and because of that, they're pretty pricey. A replacement rotor from the dealer would cost around $500 each. So for the time being, just to get this out on the road, we're going to reuse these, but we got to clean them up first. This tool is made specifically for brake rotors, and it's a good idea to hone your rotors if you're ever reusing them while installing new pads. That way, if there's any unevenness, it should smooth them out and bed in the pads appropriately. And since we know the clutch fluid was old, I'll quickly bleed these calipers while the wheel is still off. And personally, I think this will work out just fine for around town, but if the car ever went to a track, I would still plan on getting these rotors replaced. Well, I think I'm ready to take the ZL1 for a first real test drive, but before I do, there's something that's bothered me about this car, and it is these louvers. They just kind of look homemade. They almost feel homemade, and it looks like they're only held into place, look, with hand-tight nuts. I'm sure there's some double-sided tape underneath all this too. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how loose these were on. Oh my, that's hilarious. Look, I didn't even need to take that nut out of place. This thing could have been a liability. I'm glad we're taking it off. Based on how that feels, I would think that this car is making somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 wheel horsepower. But I'm not matting it completely to the floor, not yet, because just don't know the car well enough, and I don't want it to turn into a Mustang. Funny enough, I've had a bunch of Mustangs before. I've had a couple Shelby Mustangs, but this is really the first Camaro I've owned. It's the first 5th gen Camaro I've driven. And I have driven a handful of Hellcats before, and this car is just, it's quite a bit different, even though on paper it seems like very similar to all those other cars. To me, the Hellcats always felt like they're all motor and like nothing more. The Shelbys, they're again a lot of engine, but they're aesthetically the coolest cars ever. They've got those iconic stripes, the Cobra badges everywhere, the interior seats, there's stripes on those. They're just so cool. But this car, from the outside, if you looked at it next to a bunch of other 5th gen Camaros, it probably look relatively the same. But there's a lot of additional stuff Chevy probably didn't really have to put on here, but they did, and it makes it that much more a well-rounded car. Things like those two-piece brake rotors that we worked on, or like the mag ride suspension that rides really good. You can put in touring mode, and it's really soft, and it feels a lot like every other muscle car. Or you put it in sport, and it definitely firms it up quite a bit. Oh, geez Louise. The one thing I really can't believe that they put on this car is the carbon fiber hood. It's a painted hood, so you don't really know that it's carbon fiber until you open it up, feel how light it is, and then look on the underside, you'll see a little weave in there. But I imagine if Chevy just stuck with a standard steel hood, not only would they have saved a lot of money, the car probably wouldn't have sold any better or worse than it did. But that's real weight savings. Again, it's just another cool feature, and it's what makes this the best driver's car out of all the other muscle cars from this era. Another good way to test if your clutch is worn or whether it's going to slip is to put it in a high gear and put your foot all the way to the floor, which is what I've got right now. I don't want to go too fast because I don't want to get a ticket, but it's not slipping at all. Just based on how this thing drives, I can't imagine that the clutch is really that worn, but I don't think there's a good way to really tell how worn your clutch is unless you go and you pull the transmission out of the car. However, on a lot of manual transmissions, there's these inspection ports. What I think we should do real quick is just get this home, get it up on the lift, and let's take a look, see if we can actually see a worn clutch. At this angle, I'm noticing something I didn't see before, and that's this black box right behind the lower grille. Those clamps are just something that wouldn't come out of the factory. And I'm not quite sure exactly what it is from there. From the back, I guess it looks like maybe a fan shroud, which would make sense because directly above it is that cooler that we spotted earlier behind the upper grille. And if you're wondering why there are just so many coolers, especially aftermarket ones that people have added, along with a bunch of extra plumbing, and I even saw an auxiliary water pump up there, it's because when you start to add all these power mods, well, these cars are computer controlled, and if you're not keeping the car cool, it can't put down this big horsepower reliably. It's going to pull timing, and it's going to run a lot slower than it could by installing that big stainless tank. And by adding these coolers and extra plumbing and ways to move the water around, we could keep the intake air temperatures, or the air that enters the engine, much lower, and we could consistently run a number like 700 horsepower on the dyno. And it's also just a lot safer to run your car with these cooling modifications. So it is good that they did them. It looks halfway decent. There's just a lot of hose clamps everywhere. And then looking at the rest of the engine bay, looks pretty factory. It's nice and dirty. I always tell you I like to see a dirty engine bay, because if somebody really cleaned it up, especially in a car like this with around 100,000 miles, usually they're trying to hide something, or maybe it's just really well taken care of. But I don't see any heavy oil leaks or anything around the pan. I see a little bit of weeping right here, but again, nothing to the point where I'd start ripping things apart, because there's no heavy drips or leaks anywhere. And then we've got our long tube headers right here. We'll talk about the exhaust modifications in a minute, because I really like them. And it looks like somebody put some heat wrap around the starter up there. Now, what I really wanted to see is inside here. That's our inspection port for the transmission. And the best way to see in there will be with a scope camera, so I'm going to go get that in a second. But if we look at the rest of the transmission, it is really dirty. When I touch it, you see it looks like my hands look like after I did the brake job, and that's because, clutch material, brake material, it's very similar. And either this thing was romped on pretty good, or it's possible that this is just, again, 100,000 miles of clutch material that's never been cleaned off. I'm going to stop guessing and just pop a camera in here real quick. These ports are nice and big, so I can actually put my larger lens scope camera in here, where you're going to get a much clearer image than we usually do. And right off the bat, this little green springy looking thing right here, that's that slave cylinder I keep mentioning. That's where the clutch fluid is going to. That's what actuates our clutch in and out. When you push the pedal down, it takes the clutch off the flywheel, and that way you could switch gears. And then when you pull the pedal back up, it closes and it engages the clutch, and that's what sends the power from the engine through the transmission to the wheels. I hope that all makes sense. Now, this is beautiful. This has definitely been replaced. There's no way this car has 100,000 miles and this slave cylinder or throwout bearing looks as new as it does. And these can leak, these can fail, and it will cause us to have that similar symptom like we had earlier, where you push your clutch pedal down and it feels soft. But I don't see any issue with this. And then right off the back, you could see that line we were talking about where the fluid enters the cylinder itself here. It's nice, it's clean. I'm not worried about any fluid leakage there. Now, if we move the camera over a couple holes here, that's where we're going to be able to see our clutch. And that's the darker area, right sandwiched in between here. We can't get a really perfect look at it, but we can see there's clutch material. The really thin sliver in the middle, that's the disc that holds that friction material on either side. And so this clutch had to have been replaced before. In my opinion, just from this angle, it looks great. All right, I can officially stop worrying about this clutch. The thing runs and drives too good. It looks equally as good, so someone just had to misdiagnose this down the line. Now, while we still got this in the air, I did want to show you the exhaust, because the auction listed this with an aftermarket exhaust. And while that sounds exciting, when it comes to auction cars, every time I've got something that said it had an aftermarket exhaust, is usually like a muffler shop hack job where someone cuts off the mufflers, they cut off the resonators and the cats, and they sound awful. But what kind of threw me is when I got the car and I looked at the top, there's no branding on the tips here. Quick look at the muffler. These things appear to be pretty factory. They've even got the little actuator on the side with the vacuum line running to them, which is really cool. That means that this is a performance exhaust with the little baffles in them that open up at certain RPMs, which makes it so the car can sound mean, and then it can also cruise down the highway without any drone. And that's exactly what I've experienced. And looking at the rest of it here, I do see some welds. Those are probably from the factory. This, I'm not sure. It wouldn't make sense that the resonator would be so short. So that's probably also from the factory. Maybe that's a ZL1 thing, maybe not. But they kept the secondary cats and they added long tube header. So that's going to be the major exhaust mod here. This will give you a good amount of noise, but it will also give you a good amount of power. And by keeping the secondary cats, well, it eliminates a lot of that nasty smell that you get if you got rid of the cats altogether. So whoever did this did exactly what I would have done. This is the best way to spend really the least amount of money, getting the most amount of power, but enhancing the exhaust tone without going too overboard and making the car unbearable to drive.
The only money I've spent thus far on the ZL1 is that set of brake pads and that little bit of brake fluid, which was maybe $50 worth of stuff. I've got about $21,000 all into this car as it sits right now, which I think is a great deal for a 6-speed manual ZL1. However, there are a couple things that will affect this car's resale value negatively. And the first is that it's got higher miles, right? Over 100,000. But then again, it does come with a bunch of really good modifications that are already installed. So as far as values go, maybe add a couple thousand for the mods, you subtract a few thousand for the miles, and that would even this thing out. But the auction did list it with structural damage. Now, the one thing about this wholesale auction that I bought this car from, they mark any dent, ding, mark, or anything in the car's unibody as structural damage. Back here in the trunk are a bunch of tiny little holes. And they've even got a couple screws here into the body of the car, and all around those screws is a bunch of speaker wire. That's because somebody had a system in this car, and well, they were probably amateurs when they hooked it up, and they were looking for a ground. Now this is really funny to me because when I was in high school, I put a system in my first car, and it was a 2000 Honda Accord. And well, I hate to admit it to you, but I did the same exact thing that they did back there because I didn't know any better. I knew that a ground had to be bare metal so you could scuff a little bit of the paint off of the body. And then I actually didn't even drill into it. I used alligator clips to clip onto the metal of the car's frame. In hindsight, it would have been much smarter and easier to just go and take a few trim panels out of the trunk there, and you'll find grounds all over the back of the car because there's electronics that run all in your trunk area. The only problem here is that whenever an auction does run something with structural damage, a lot of times that does carry over into cars' history reports. So if someone goes and pulls a VIN report on this car, it might come back with structural damage just because of that. But it would be easy enough to show the original auction listing and show it in person, really, that there's nothing really compromised with this car's body, at least not that I've seen.
So if you're like me and think that $21,000 is super cheap for the Supercharged ZL1 Camaro, be sure to hit that like button. If you don't like the deal, let me know why down in the comments. I hope you learned something from this one. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel so you're updated next time I go gambling at the auction. But until then, I really appreciate each and every one of you watching today. I'll catch you very soon.